Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you didn't hear Miss Debbie's question before we started the service, thanks to Tony for setting her up for that. We are going to be in the Gospel of Mark chapter 5. And I feel like he was trying to lead her to ask the question how long we were going to be in the Gospel of Mark. To which the simple answer is yes. No, we're going to be in Mark chapter 5 this afternoon, and as we come into this portion of the gospel account where we're being once again, I don't want to say introduced to the deity of Christ, but His power is once again put on display. I told you in chapter 4, there's only 2 chapters in all of Mark that are really recorded as teaching sections. Mark 4 is one of them, but now that's ended. We're going back into the miracles, which is what has captivated, or would have captivated, the Roman audience in an effort to prove the statement that Mark began the gospel with. That He is in fact the Son of God, equal to God, which is a bold statement. It is the statement of statements to make, and you have to back it up. You have to prove it. Chapter 5 needs, actually all the accounts in chapter 5, need very little introduction. That didn't mean I wasn't going to introduce it. I'm always going to introduce them. They need very little introduction because they're amazing. They're stories that captivate us, and yet they're true accounts. What we read about this afternoon is one of the greatest overthrowing of the demonic, certainly that we have detail of, since Satan and his rebellion army was cast out of heaven. We know a third of them fell, Revelation 12:4. But from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, it was always doing what the Bible tells us He was there to do. John says in 1 John 3:8, we actually had 3:9 in the morning service, 3:8, says, the Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. That's His purpose, which of course is the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. Now, a lot of times I read these passages and I find myself wondering why. I've been so blessed by God to get to spend time in these passages to where I'm almost asking a little bit different questions now as I go back through, especially if I've studied it before. I want to look at it now through the lens of a different question. Don't ever just, when you're studying the Bible, don't keep asking yourself the same questions. When you read it and you're going through it again, ask yourself a different question. So the one I find myself asking now is, why? Why did Jesus end up in the predicament that He was in? Why did the Holy Spirit deem it necessary for these men to record this specific account? And I feel sure you've heard sermons preached on this before. I've done it myself over the years. On Mark chapter 5, the demoniac, where you got chapter 4 and Jesus calms the sea, and it's this idea of a calming nature, and then we understand we have the ability to overcome storms and overcome struggles. Well, struggle being, you get to chapter 5 and you got this demon possession, and I've preached it that way before, but I am convinced now that the passage before us is really all about power. Satan has power given him by God. He's the angel cast out of heaven, the ruler of this world. And we see time and time again that the power His angels, they have over people. On the other hand, Christ, He has power to heal the sick, raise the dead, power to speak to a raging storm. It's going to cease. But more than that, Christ has absolute power over Satan. He has absolute power over the enemy. And that leaves me with so much encouragement that I come to understand why this is recorded. Why is it here? So when we turn to chapter 5 and we begin in the text, we kind of get this introductory statement. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. That is, they crossed the Sea of Galilee, and we know that was an adventurous journey, to say the least, an exciting adventure, where the apostles were left terrified. They were terrified of the storm, and yet we read that they're even more terrified of the fact that Jesus calmed the storm. Because if you remember the exact wording, it says, in the storm they were afraid. But then in the boat, once Jesus calmed the storm, it says, and they were exceedingly afraid. I mean, they were terrified because they're trying to figure out, well, who is this? That the sea obeys His voice. So they're traveling from northwest. You can kind of see the arrow there. They're traveling from the northwest of the sea, the 11-mile journey to the southeast, to the area of the Gadarenes. On the bottom there of the map it says Gadara. What they're also traveling to is they're traveling from the population center, Capernaum, to Gadara, which is the boonies. High population, no population. Now, your translation, if there's any confusion, just so you know, your translation may say the Gerasenes. That's just that's a region within Gadara. So they're describing the same area. Now, all the while, we're still not told exactly why Jesus went there. And I imagine the swarming crowds, the long nights, we're told that he wasn't even able to eat, that maybe Jesus just wanted some rest. I feel sure the disciples of Jesus had no clue as to why they're going, because this was an area they stayed away from. This is Gentile land. In fact, Gadara, this is part of the Decapolis, the 10 Gentile cities. The Jews would have not gone near there. Now, they would go around, they'd actually loop around to come down, and they had to go to Jerusalem once a year, but that's because they refused to go through Samaria. They would actually go around to avoid Samaria, but they wouldn't go spend any time in Gadara. They wouldn't be around the Gadarenes, the Gerasenes, because they're Gentiles. But you kind of get the feeling that maybe something bigger is at play here. And so, what I want you to see first, as you get to Mark chapter 5, the first couple of verses, you're going to get a comparison here. The power of Satan versus the power of Jesus. This whole section, and arguably the whole chapter, is about power. What power does Jesus really have? Well, to understand that, you have to understand the power that Satan has. Verse 2, and when he came out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains. Now, I do imagine that after the journey they had just gone across, going over the sea, and the disciples were hoping for some rest, right? They had a long night, and yet rest is far from what they're going to get. They're met by a welcoming party. Probably not a welcoming party you'd hope for. It's not the mayor, it's not the governor, it's not the ruler of Gadara. It's by a severely possessed demonic man, someone under the power of Satan who has no control of his own body. Because of this particular man that we're going to look at was kicked out of the city into the tombs as an outcast. Not hard to understand why. The people are terrified of this guy, and for good reason. But much like the apostles on the boat with Jesus, they haven't seen anything yet. Now, it is interesting that Mark makes the point to tell us that the man is in the tombs. Because again, Jews wouldn't go near there. Do you know what one of the worst things you could say to a Jew was? Unclean. That's one of the worst phrases you could utter to a Jew is unclean. Being around dead bodies would make you unclean. Never mind the fact that they'd be unclean just by being in Gentile land around Gentiles in the first place. So things are going to go from strange to stranger. Now, you saw the map earlier, but that's inland. Where it's, well, actually, I can just bring it back up. Where Gadara is on the bottom right, that's not where they're going to really end up. That's inland more. If you actually go into a more finite map that shows the smaller villages and towns in what they call the biblical times map, you'd find on the banks of the sea a little village, little town called Kursi. That's the town where Gerasa was. This town, up until the 1970s, they didn't even know where this was. Now, thanks to archaeological exploration, we know exactly where this was. And what you can see, if you look up, write this phrase down if you want to look this up. The open tombs of Kursi. K-U-R-S-I. And you can actually see that these aren't sealed tombs like what you think of with the Jews. These are just open caves. And what they would do when someone died, they would just put the bodies inside this open cave. It's an open tomb. This guy made his home there. Seems he's more comfortable among the dead than the living. Now, Matthew 8 does add to the fact that there's not actually one man there, there's two. But as the account unfolds, the other man is kind of left behind, and the focus of the synoptics shift to this one demon-possessed man. Now we do know that he's filled with unclean spirits. He's called the demoniac because these unclean spirits are demons. Now we spent a lot of time, and I'm not going to go back through this. When we were going through the angels and demons study that we went through, we spent an exhaustive amount of time going over demons and fallen angels and how we get to the understanding of who these people were, these beings, I shouldn't say people, these beings were. That they're servants of Satan, they're fallen angels, they're the ones kicked out of heaven. Luke adds to this that this man is naked, which is a perversion. He's fully possessed with these demons. In essence, the power of Satan is ruling this man's life. And so Mark is going to use 2 verses to prove the power here. Mark verse 4, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. They're trying to bind this man, right? They're terrified of him, so they're trying to bind him, and yet the shackles broke into pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. They tried to bind him, they couldn't do it. So what else could the people do with a maniac like this other than chain him up and get him away? Do you understand? We do the same thing today still. If the police have to come and arrest you, guess what the first thing they're going to do is? They're going to put you in handcuffs. Well, I was going to pick on Marshall, I'm not going to do it. Say Marshall will tell you all about it, but I'm not going to do it. I wouldn't do that. Which they're handcuffed to subdue them. Now, it wouldn't work on this man because the demon inside the man were too strong, so they would just simply snap the chains like they were nothing, which had the people terrified. Now, Luke again adds that these demons would carry this man off into the wilderness. And what the point of this, what Mark and Luke both are trying to get you to understand, is this man had no control over this. These demons were having their way with this man. He couldn't stop them. He couldn't tell them no. He was powerless over these demons. And again, verse 5. Not verse 7. Not 6. Verse 5. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, and he was crying out and cutting himself with stones. That phrase is one that's interested me. You see, this man is just a vessel. Can you imagine his life being constantly tortured, constantly challenged, constantly berated, gashing himself, sleepless, restless, wandering in and out of tombs? And I'll be honest with you, when I say this passage has always interested me, it's that last phrase that he was crying out and cutting himself with stones. And I find myself wondering if it was the demon doing this, and the demon is cutting the man, he's trying to hurt his vessel, or was the man cutting himself, trying to end his life so that this would just be over with. It doesn't tell us. It's just conjecture, it's speculation. It doesn't tell us specifically. But I find myself wondering because these demons are such a terror, so violent that no one would even go by this man. Kind of like that mean, aggressive neighbor that you wish would move out of your neighborhood that you don't really want around. Now, I'm really trying to emphasize this point because understanding all of this and the reality that everyone knows that the man, that's going to help make the people's choice even more confusing. But the question is, what power did this man have? What power did the people have over the demon who would snap chains, run people off? And the simple answer is they had no power. So I want you to understand this reality that you versus Satan, and I don't say this phrase lightly, you versus Satan will lose every time. Satan is one of the most powerful beings ever created. And every time I hear someone utter this phrase, I wish Satan would bring it on against me, I'm like, you fool. Why? But now notice the difference. But when he saw Jesus from afar off, he ran and worshipped him. Now let me ask you another question because this has always blown my mind. How in the world did this demon know that Jesus was there? The man had never seen Jesus before, had he? We don't have any records that ever tell us that Jesus stepped foot in Gadara before this moment, or Kursi, or Gerasa, or any of the regions on the southeast area of the Sea of Galilee. We don't have any record that he was ever there. So the man didn't know. There's no way the man could have known who Jesus was. Word was getting out about all he was doing, fair enough. But not anyone close to this man. He wasn't allowed around other people. He couldn't go into the town and the villages. How could he have known? And then I always remember that the demons have experience with the Lord, right? Which is why every time a demon sees Jesus, they just kind of sit and try to blend in, right? Is that what they do? Why every time does a demon-possessed person see Jesus, why do they shriek and yell out and scream every single time? You don't read one time and they just sat there and they try to hide and try to blend in, even though that's what they would usually attempt to do. Remember the one that screamed out when he was in the synagogue? How often do you think he was in church services? In worship there, in the synagogue. They just blended in. No one ever knew. Until Jesus walks in. But notice this, the demon-possessed man drops to his knees in the presence of Jesus and worships. Now don't be confused in this. The Greek word there for worship is proskuneo, which means a bowing down in reverence, showing respect to one greater than yourself. Something no one else was able to do with this demon. They would run from him, stay away from him, and yet as soon as the demon saw Jesus, he runs and collapses in front of him. But think about that from the possessed man's perspective. This, of course, has to be confusing because he'd have no idea who Jesus is, but the demons do. They know when they're in the king's presence. So notice their response to the Lord. And he cried out. So there was no just sitting and being quiet. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." This shouldn't be a surprise. This is kind of their typical response to Jesus. But essentially they're asking the question, hey, what do we have to do with you? And the phrase there means, what business do we have with each other? What do you want from us? But they don't just say, hey, what do you want from us? And for the sake of yours, I'm not going to do it. They scream that question. Now, I do find it interesting, and I've mentioned this before, that these demons, outside of God at the baptism of Jesus Christ, are the only ones professing Jesus as the Son of God. You have to get all the way to basically the halfway mark through the book before Jesus' disciples make even a version of that confession. And really you have to get all the way to the end of the book when the centurion makes the confession that surely this is the Son of God. We had the demons, of course, say it from the very beginning. As soon as they're in the presence of Jesus, they bow, they cry, they're showing reverence because they know who He is. Actually, let me clarify that. They bow in fear, understanding who He is. Reverence is a very different term. So let's look at their question. What business do we have with each other? Why do you think they're curious? Do they know that they're waiting eternal destruction? Yes. Do they know that there's a final judgment coming towards them? Yes. And do they know that Jesus is the one that will pass judgment on them? Yes. They know that they do in fact have business coming with Jesus. The only aspect of the whole thing they don't know is when. When is this going to happen? That's what concerns them. When is this going to happen? These are not supposed to be connected with the first coming of Jesus. These are second coming things, right? These are when you come back. That's what the account is really trying to detail for us. And in Matthew 8 he adds, have you come to torment us before the appointed time? And we know it's coming, but it's not time yet. That's interesting that they're terrified of being tormented, And yet they have no issue tormenting the man. Or even the people they interact with. But Jesus' response is too perfect. And I'll tell you why. He said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Did he say to the demon, "Hey, hang on. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stretch. I'm going to loosen up. I'm going to get my mind right. I'm going to go get me some holy water and a few other things. And I'm going to take care of this demon, and I'm going to start like the Moses." It needs the imagery we get. Like Moses with the staff stretched out. "Demon, be gone." Just some big... That's kind of the imagery you're getting, right? What did he say? "Hey, come out." That's all he did. Same thing when he talked to the sea. And again, this is me when I was a kid. For some reason, I had that same imagery, hand and staff, standing in the front of the boat. And maybe it was just movies I saw trying to pick biblical events because they have to, it's got to be sold for Hollywood, right? Now he's standing in the front of the boat, and it's almost like he just like smacks the staff down and, "Peace, be still." And yet, what's the reality? Peace. That's it. He does this like it's nothing. This demon is here snapping chains. People are terrified. They're staying away from the man. He's an outcast, living in tombs. Jesus just walks up. Guy falls down, starts worshiping him. He says, "Come out." That's it. That's all the power Jesus has to exert. You, out. And guess what happened after that? Did the demon say, "Hey, whoa, Jesus, hang on, let's talk about this. We're comfortable with the guy." When God commands, they listen. So this multitude of demons comes out of the man, not by choice, but because they were commanded to do so. And really, this is where the account begins to heat up, because there's still a tremendous amount of power to display that's really going to be unfolded for us as we go. And then there's another part of this account that just has always, again, baffled me when I think about this, especially the people's response to Jesus after he performed such an incredible miracle. But that's a lesson for next week, Lord willing. Unless y'all want to stay for another hour, I'm good either way. No, just... And so I read through accounts like this. In fact, I'll tell you, it's verse 8 is where we're going to hold up. I read through accounts like this as a Bible student and studying these, and I keep finding myself asking that question, why? Like, why? Why is this recorded? Why did Jesus go to Gadara, to Kursi, to Gerasa in the first place when the people were on the northeastern side? Once you got past Capernaum, and to be fair, you could come south along the sea and still be heavy population. But once you got around central north, going northeast, you had nothing. I mean, that's not where the people are. Why record this for us that we're still talking about this 2,000 years later? And I come again to realize it's about power. The Holy Spirit who inspired these words to be penned by the hand of Mark wants us to walk away with this great truth. There is no power like the power of God. There is no power like the power of God in the flesh. The same God that spoke all of creation into existence, that holds the fabric of the world together, has complete control over every aspect of His creation. Which is why nature obeys, demons scream, seas stop, dead rise. And so we end up being left with a certain reality. Do we have a powerful enemy in the world? Yes. Which is why I made this statement I did. The Bible doesn't shy away from the power of Satan. The power Satan has, God gave him. No more, no less. Satan is described as a roaring lion going around seeking whom he may devour. And that's why I said every time I hear someone just throwing the gauntlet down and saying, "Oh, I wish Satan would come after me." I'm glad you do. I don't. But what I do know is the Lord I follow has total control over Satan. He has power over Satan. My faith is in Him, and I know through Him I can overcome the world. I don't have to worry about Satan. That don't mean I'm going to go out looking for a fight with Satan. That means I'm going to trust in the one more powerful than Satan. But I find comfort and I find peace in that reality, and I firmly believe that's why we have these accounts. To help us to understand the power that God has, to know that Jesus is in control. So I come to this point in closing, and really, this is where we're going to pick up next week. This is really two-part, just because if we really tried to go the whole section, it really was going to be like an hour. I didn't want to revolt or anything like that. So we're going to take this and pick up. But it's with the idea of deliverance from the power of Satan, deliverance from the world order of Satan. It comes from Jesus. And Mark makes the point that we would understand clearly how deliverance comes. You know, I guess I should have already posed this in the sermon. You do know what deliverance means, right? I'm not talking about some weird horror movie. I feel like I saw Xander kind of nod his head when I said that. I'm not talking about some weird horror movie. You're okay. I do that a lot. Deliverance means to be rescued or set free. And we get an example like this to see a man who had no power, no control, at the mercy of Satan and these demons until Jesus comes. And when Jesus comes, deliverance comes. That's the moral of this account. When Jesus comes, deliverance comes, because Jesus can deliver all things from the power of Satan, because He's more powerful than Satan. That's the essence of what He's describing here. So as we close this afternoon, I want you to take that message with you. We're going to pick up here, Lord willing, next week, and we'll see kind of the back half of this, what unfolds from this account. Again, it's one you're familiar with, but we're going to go into the rest of this account with that same question. Why do we have this? Why was it necessary to give us this information? That's where we're going to go with this. But understand how deliverance comes, the power in which deliverance comes. That is through God, who overcomes Satan, overcomes the powers of this world. So as we close this afternoon, if there's anyone in need, Brother Ernest will lead us in the invitation song here in just a second. This will be an opportunity for you if you need the prayers of the congregation, if you're one that's struggling, one that's dealing with difficulties in life. The power of Satan is not just a demon possession. The power of Satan is all the evil we see in the world. And so if there's anyone struggling with that, if there's anyone in need, I want to encourage you to come as the rest of us we stand and we sing this invitation song.
Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood. From your passion and pride, there's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for our cleansing to Calvary's side. There's one